received an Academic Freedom Distinguished Professor of Neurology. Has other titles as well. Washington University School of Medicine.
To the mic.
I'm sorry. He's also director and principal investigator of the David F. and Joanne Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Washington University School of Medicine. Dr. Morris received his medical degree from Rochester School of Medicine, and the focus of his practice and research has been Alzheimer's disease and other neurological diseases associated with aging. He's a former member of the Alzheimer's Association National Board of Directors and the Medical Scientific Advisory Council. And currently is a member of the Board of Directors of the American Academy of Neurology. He's the author of very many books, papers, peer-reviewed articles, and he's received many honors, too many to enumerate here. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Morris, who flew in from St. Louis to be with us today and join us in hearing his talk on Alzheimer's.
We're going to flip the lights right on.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Everyone able to hear in the back? Yeah, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I really thank you for the opportunity to come and address you about Alzheimer's disease. I want to particularly thank Joe Sweeney over here. Joe's sister-in-law developed Alzheimer's disease at a very young age and just passed away this past January. His sister-in-law was my wife's sorority mate at Cornell University, and so this was a very personal thing for us. And Joe, as well as his colleagues here, have decided for several years now to have a golf tournament to raise funding for Alzheimer's research, and he's been generous enough to provide it to us at our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center in St. Louis. So I want to thank Joe and all the members of his golf tournament for raising money in support of Alzheimer's research. Thank you very much. All right. This is our group at Washington University. Many talented researchers, physicians, very dedicated staff and volunteers. And it's a privilege for me to be able to lead this great team. So let's talk about definitions. So the first thing to talk about is dementia. When people talk about dementia, what people think about may not always be the same thing. So let me define it in terms of what we consider dementia to be. First, it's a loss, a decline in an individual's ability to think and to remember. They're losing their memory and thinking abilities. Second, it can't simply be a complaint about this loss of memory and thinking abilities. It has to be sufficient enough that it begins to interfere with that person's ability to carry out his or her usual activities. It has to cause them to become less able to do everyday functions. And I'll describe this a little bit later. So memory and thinking declining interferes with daily life. That's dementia. Now, we diagnose dementia in several ways. The most important way, in my opinion, is we try to understand what the person's memory and thinking abilities and their ability to function in everyday life once was, and how they decline relative to their prior abilities. We call that intra-individual decline. And another way we can do it is to test their memory and thinking abilities and compare it, their performance, to that of other people of the same age who don't have memory and thinking abilities. So we're comparing them then to other people's scores. dementia. I'll demonstrate a little bit how we detect it and go through the different phases of dementia. Because dementia begins very insidiously. It's hard to tell at the beginning whether a person is losing their memory and thinking abilities, but it always gets worse. Once we diagnose dementia, then the next step is to try to determine what causes the dementia. So first, diagnose dementia. Second, what are the causes? Memory and thinking abilities are a brain disorder. So when we talk about the causes of dementia, we're talking about understanding brain illness. And here's a diagram of some of the more common causes of dementia. Right at the center is Alzheimer's disease. It's by far the most common cause of dementia. But it's not the only cause. So there are people who have dementia because they have had strokes in the areas of the brain that are responsible for memory and thinking. Parkinson's disease can cause dementia. We call it here Lewy body disease. Another form of dementia is frontotemporal dementia. There are many causes of dementia, but by far the most common cause is Alzheimer's. So let me see if I have this communicated this appropriately to you. Dementia, the loss of memory and thinking abilities. Alzheimer's, the most common cause of dementia. So think of it this way. Everybody with Alzheimer's will have dementia, but not everybody with dementia will have Alzheimer's. Does that make sense? Because sometimes people use those terms interchangeably. Right? All right. So, by the way, there's nothing about having Alzheimer's disease that protects you against other brain diseases. So many people who have Alzheimer's also have strokes. So they have 2 or more causes of dementia. But we'll talk a little bit more about this. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, most people conjure up in their mind a person who is pretty severely demented, lost a lot of memory and thinking ability, needs a lot of help to function in everyday life. But when we at Washington University talk about dementia, we're talking about, talk about Alzheimer's disease, we're talking about the brain disorder. And the brain disorder is a loss of the brain cells and their connections called synapses. We believe that this process begins for decades before there's any change in memory and thinking ability. So there's a long, asymptomatic, silent period of Alzheimer's disease where brain cells are being affected, and it's only when a lot of brain cells are affected that the brain can't function and the memory and thinking problems begin. So we talk about 2 phases of Alzheimer's: preclinical, silent, no clinical symptoms, and then symptomatic or clinical. So Alzheimer's disease is a long illness stretching over decades. Now, I indicated to you that I will demonstrate one way to diagnose dementia, and I show here the performance on our cognitive test of 2 of our healthy volunteers in the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. The vertical line here is the performance of all of our healthy older volunteers, where 0 indicates the average performance of all of our healthy volunteers. Now, some individuals are really good and they perform 1 or 2 times better than most of their peers, and some don't do as well. So I show here 2 people. The first is a man, and he's scoring right at the average of all of our healthy volunteers. And here is a woman, and she's almost 2 times poorer performing than the rest of our healthy volunteers. So if we had this set of cognitive test results at this point in time, we would say that the man is normal and the woman is impaired. So let's see what happened to them over time. We evaluate people annually, every year. And so over the next couple times of assessment, look what happened to the man, and look what happened to the woman. So she's stable, even though she didn't score well. She's not declining, but the man is declining. And we have earlier information on these two people that I'll demonstrate here. So let's take a look at this. We had seen both of them 6 years earlier, and the man at the beginning was one of our top performers. He's twice as good as all of our healthy volunteers. He looked like he was pretty stable, more or less, for 6 years, but then he started declining right here. And I showed you his performance at this phase, and according to his comparison with other people, we'd say he was normal here, but this represents a big loss from what his prior abilities were. Does that make sense? So it's not how you do in comparison with others, it's how you're doing compared to where you once were. Does that make sense? The woman is stable. She never changed. So here is a depiction of the first known person with Alzheimer's disease, a woman here. She was 51 years of age. I'm sorry, in the back, I realize it's a small photograph. When she was taken to an insane asylum in Frankfurt, Germany. Her husband brought her, and this was back in 1901. There was no treatment for mental disorders or epilepsy, so people were housed in an asylum. And the husband took her to this asylum because he no longer could manage her at home. The person who admitted her, the physician who admitted her, was a psychiatrist named Alzheimer. And Professor Alzheimer interviewed the husband, why are you bringing your wife here? Well, 4 years earlier, so at age 47, she began to decline in her memory and thinking abilities. It was very subtle at first, but as it got worse, the husband had to sort of help her carry out her usual functions, had to watch her when she was cooking to make sure she didn't burn the food. Eventually, she lost the ability to shop. She couldn't remember what they needed. And so he gradually started assisting her, and then later on started to actually have to do those functions for her because she lost the mental ability to do it. She was a wanderer, so he couldn't leave her home in their apartment. He had to take her with her. And at this point, at age 51, she developed suspiciousness, paranoia. And she was particularly suspicious that her husband was having affairs. Spousal infidelity. This is not an uncommon suspicion of Alzheimer's patients. And remember, he's having to take her in 1901 to the town market, go to the different stalls to get the food. And of course, there were women at the stalls who were selling the produce. And when he would start to negotiate what he wanted to buy, he had to bring his wife with him. She would fly into a fit of jealous rage, thinking he was arranging an affair with this shopkeeper. She was particularly suspicious of a neighbor lady in their apartment building, and what precipitated her admission to the insane asylum was that she'd be up all night yelling at the neighbor lady next door and saying terrible things, very disruptive to the entire, to the husband, to the neighbor lady, but the entire apartment building. So he finally brought her to this asylum. And she was there for about 4.5 years. She died. When she died, Alzheimer got the brain, and he looked at it under the microscope, and he found lesions, they're clumps, these dark little circles that now we call the plaque. I'll describe it in just a moment. And within nerve cells, he found other dark substances that we call the tangle. These are the original photomicrographs from the brain of this person. And these are available in Munich, where Alzheimer's eventually relocated in a museum there. And I was able to get the photomicrographs reproduced. So this is the original Alzheimer changes, plaques and tangles in the brain, so small they can only be seen under the microscope. Here are plaques and tangles with more modern techniques. The plaques are in the brain substance, and they disrupt the brain from being able to communicate with one another. The tangles are in the nerve cells themselves and indicate that the nerve cells are dying. Plaques and tangles. We've learned a lot. We know that the plaques now are made up of a substance we call amyloid. It's depicted here as amyloid beta. It's a protein. I'll talk about it. And the tangles are made up of another protein, tau. These are both normal proteins, we all have them, but in Alzheimer's disease they get mishandled and they don't work right, so they get deposited as plaques and tangles. Bottom line in Alzheimer's disease, nerve cells die. And the nerve cells that die first are the parts of our brain that are most developed throughout the animal kingdom, come to fruition in humans, higher cortical functions. Memory, reasoning, language, attention, personality, those die first. We don't know why those areas are selected. So what happens, we see two half brains here. Here's the brain of a person who died with Alzheimer's, and here's another person who did not have Alzheimer's at time of death. And you can see the brain shrinks because the nerve cells are dying. So the fluid areas of the brain, these cavities, are much enlarged compared to what they should be. And this is we call it brain atrophy. I apologize, I meant to change this. I call this a healthy brain. I mean, the person is dead. So, but they did not have Alzheimer's. Alzheimer, the reason we call it Alzheimer's disease is he took a special interest in this woman, and he thought that these brain changes, he was the first to recognize these. He thought that these brain changes talked about gave him information about a disease process that caused her dementia and her paranoia, her suspiciousness. So he said, this is an illness. He didn't know what it was, but this is an illness, it's a process, and here's what it caused in this woman. He gave a talk to other psychiatrists in 1906 and presented this case. No one paid attention to it. Matter of fact, at the end of the meeting, his report of this woman wasn't even included in the proceedings. No one thought much about it. In 2006, 100 years later, I was privileged to be invited to go back to the place where he presented this. It's a university town in Germany called Tübingen. The lecture hall is still there, the podium was still there, and I got to present my research at the centenary celebration of Alzheimer's, first report of the first known person with Alzheimer's disease. At this centenary celebration, I met a German who also was interested in Alzheimer in his life and the first Alzheimer patient, and he brought me up to date on this first Alzheimer case. After the woman died, of course, her husband was a widower, and about a year later he remarried, and it was that neighbor lady. For 80 years or so after Alzheimer's first case was reported, nobody paid much attention to Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't until the 1980s that people even started using the term Alzheimer's. Now, you all, I can see, are too young to know this, but back then, people used terms like hardening of the arteries or senility, things of that sort. We didn't even call it Alzheimer's. And the reason is there wasn't very much of Alzheimer's disease. Although that first Alzheimer case was quite young when she developed the symptoms, 93% of people who have Alzheimer's disease are 70 years and older. When she developed the first case, 1901, when she developed Alzheimer's disease, do you know what the average life expectancy was in the United States? 47 years. So not very many people lived to the age where they got Alzheimer's. That's why we didn't think about it very much. Now I show here the demographics of the population in the United States from 1950 up to projected 2020. Each bar represents an age, the youngest age at the bottom, the oldest age at the top, and the bars in red are 65 and older. So in 1950, we had very few people 65 and older. Now, of course, the baby boomers are here, people born from 1946 to 1964. As they get older, the population overall increases, but look at the marked increase in the red bars, the number of people who are now living to the age at which they become vulnerable. So that's why we're thinking so much more about Alzheimer's in the past 30 years, is because it's becoming much more prevalent because of our aging population. Does that make sense? Look. So this shows the age-associated frequency of Alzheimer's in the population. I'll just show this slide. At about age 65, there are some people, like that first Alzheimer case, who develop Alzheimer's dementia prior to age 65, but it's a very small number. At age 65, it really takes off. So if we say here, for example, that 5% of the population at age 65 has Alzheimer's dementia, just 5 years later, age 70 here, it's gone up to 10%. It's doubled. 5 years after that, age 75, it's gone up to 20%. Every 5 years it doubles after age 65. Up to age 85, it's 50%. Remarkable association with age. It's a terrible illness. I know some of you, many, perhaps most of you, have had experience in your families with people with Alzheimer's disease. It's a miserable disorder. It's miserable for the patient, but quite frankly, very often the patient is somewhat protected because typically they lose insight. And sometimes don't even think they have a memory problem. But the family who ends up caring for the patient always has to take on the increasing burden. I think it's the fourth most common cause of death in the United States. It's the most expensive illness in the United States, and it's going to take a concerted effort to find effective therapies for the disorder. Unlike other major killers, we have no effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, what are the risk factors for Alzheimer's? We've already talked about the number one risk factor, getting older. We all want to live long, but we all want to live long with our memory and thinking intact. We don't want to develop Alzheimer's dementia. So number one, age is the main risk factor. Number two, genetics. So this gets complicated pretty quick. I'm going to save time and happy to answer questions, but there are three genetic forms of Alzheimer's disease. Number one, Down syndrome. Everybody who is born with Down syndrome will develop Alzheimer's disease, usually before age 40 years. Number two, there are some genes that we can inherit from our parents that if they're not made properly, we call it a mutation, will cause Alzheimer's disease. The three genes are there: amyloid precursor protein APP, presenilin 1, presenilin 2. They're very rare. Less than 1% of everybody who has Alzheimer's dementia has it caused by a gene mutation. But that's known because it causes very early onset Alzheimer's. As a matter of fact, that first Alzheimer case, remember her symptoms began at age 47. She had a pre-syndromic 1 mutation. She was a genetic mutation case, but very rare. By far the most common genetic influence is we inherit from our parents a set of genes. They're not mutated, but they give us our characteristics. For example, my parents come from, their families come from Northern European areas, and hence I am pale. I have very little pigment in my skin. My parents were fair-skinned also. Before I had children, I was a redhead. And so they gave me a genetic profile of hypopigmentation. So it turns out that profile makes me susceptible to something. What it made me susceptible for, I remember very vividly as a child, going out to play, sunburn, absolutely. I was embarrassed. My mother would dress me in long sleeve shirts when I went to the swimming pool because I got burned very easily. Now, does my genetic predisposition cause me to get sunburned? No. I have to go out in the sun, right? But I'm at risk for it. I'm susceptible. And that's what families can have in their genetic. They can have susceptibility genes that make us more likely to develop Alzheimer's. Does that make sense now? It doesn't cause it. It doesn't cause it, but it makes us more susceptible. That's why Alzheimer's tends to run in families. Have you heard about that? So, all right. Well, what can we do to protect against getting Alzheimer's? Well, if we choose our parents very well, we can also inherit protective factors. And there are some families, maybe you know of people who tend to have longevity into the 90s, even the 100s, and keep their minds intact. So some people can inherit protective genes. Okay? Diet. So a heart healthy diet is good. Alcohol, you know, it's controversial. People say moderate amount of alcohol can be protective. Who has heard that red wine may protect against Alzheimer's? You know, there's scientific literature on this that, yeah, it may be protective. A little bit of conflict of interest. The first report saying that red wine protects against Alzheimer's came from researchers at the University of Bordeaux. But many people have subsequently suggested that. But it's always moderate. And, you know, of course, people want to know what moderate means, but it's moderate. But the bottom line, I think, is the most important, and that is staying active. Active mentally, active physically, active socially. Engaged. Stay engaged. And it is true that if you take a group of older adults who do not have Alzheimer's dementia, take a group of older adults who do have Alzheimer's dementia, the group without dementia, much more likely to be engaged in, let's say, playing Sudoku or playing bridge, playing chess. And so it's good to stay mentally active. But it hasn't yet been shown that staying mentally active actually protects against having Alzheimer's dementia. It may be, for example, that the people who are playing bridge were somehow born with a bigger, better brain. And they gravitated to playing bridge because of their innate brain power. And that's what's protected. Does that make sense? So it's You know, the two may go together, but doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. And I will tell you, there are Nobel Prize winners, mentally active, who had Alzheimer's disease. So just staying mentally active alone cannot assure protection against Alzheimer's. It won't hurt. It may help. Please do it. I tell all my patients to stay engaged. But I have to tell you, in my long research, I began in 1983 in Alzheimer's disease. I've only found one mental activity that is guaranteed to protect against Alzheimer's. You probably all know what it is, right? It's attending lectures of the Pelican Bay Men's So I'll illustrate the typical course, and typical is a bad word. Every patient is unique, not everyone has their own course, but in general, this is the way Alzheimer's dementia progresses. And the course of Alzheimer's dementia is 7 to 10 years. It begins in a very gradual, very insidious way, as I said earlier, hard to tell whether it really is a problem or not. But it always gets worse. Memory and thinking always decline. Gradual at first, but by this stage, the mild stage, it's clear, at least to people who know the individual well, that they've slipped. They're not the same as they were in terms of their memory and thinking ability. They tend to repeat themselves. And remember, this is all a change from before, because remember we're saying what the person once was like and now what they're like now. And it has to be a change. So they tend to ask questions that have already been answered. They have short-term memory loss. They remember long ago, but not what yesterday happened. Their judgment, their decisions are bad. But, by gosh, they still maintain their ability to dress themselves appropriately, to bathe, to groom, to eat, to toilet. They're independent. And if you didn't know them, well, know what they were once like, and just met them casually, you wouldn't think there's a problem. They look and act normal. I'll tell you, 50% of people in this mild stage of Alzheimer's dementia are out there driving automobiles. I'm not saying they should, but they tend to appear normal. Disease always gets worse. So it goes on to the moderate stage, and here's where people now need help with even their basic activities. They may dress themselves, but someone has to be there to make sure they don't put on their trousers inside out, or they don't select clothes that they've worn for the past 3 days, or something like that. So someone has to supervise. Also now, they would appear impaired even to a casual observer. They can't go out into the community by themselves. They always have to be accompanied. And this is the stage where some of those problems that the first Alzheimer case experienced come up. The suspiciousness. They put down their purse, they forget where they put it, they immediately assume someone stole it. It can be very difficult. Anxiety, depression, suspiciousness, very difficult for the family to care for this. Remember, that's what prompted the admission of that first case to the insane asylum. The third stage, severe stage, is just awful. The person doesn't recognize anybody. Awful for the family. They require total care. They can't control their bladder, their bowels, can't swallow appropriately. People ask, why do people with Alzheimer's disease die? It usually is because of pneumonia, often because as they try to take in fluids or food, it goes down the wrong pipe, doesn't go down to the stomach, goes into the lungs, causes pneumonia. They lose nutrition, they lose hydration. So it's a miserable, miserable time. And everybody who has Alzheimer's disease will die of Alzheimer's disease. Uniformly fatal. I mentioned it's the fourth leading cause of death. Number one, heart disease, heart attacks. I'm sure some of you here know people who have had a heart attack and survived. Second leading cause of death, cancer. Sure some of you here know people with cancer who are cured or in remission. Third leading cause, stroke. Some of you know people who've had a stroke and have recovered. None of you know anybody with Alzheimer's who has survived. Nobody. It's uniformly fatal. I'll skip this one. So I mentioned we don't have any effective therapies for Alzheimer's disease. So we do have drugs that have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. I list the names here. You may recognize some of them. But they are trying to help Alzheimer's symptoms. They don't get at the root cause of the disease. They don't stop the disease process. And to be frank, they don't help very much the symptoms. They're just not very good drugs. They're not cures. They're not very effective symptoms. We've tried to look at drugs that get at the root cause of Alzheimer's disease. I won't go through all of them in the back, you can't see, but there are many different targets that have been that we've tried to attack with these drugs and see if they can benefit people with Alzheimer's disease. They've all failed. All of these have had negative results. None of these drugs have worked. Now, why is that? So I'm going to suggest it's because of this. Remember I talked about just a while ago the Alzheimer dementia phase. All of those failed drugs that I mentioned were given to people who had Alzheimer's disease dementia in this phase here. But remember early on I said we think Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain many years, decades before the symptoms appear. And the reason the symptoms appear is because this buildup of Alzheimer pathology over decades eventually causes so much nerve cell loss that the dementia occurs. And if we wait to give drugs to people who have the dementia, we're giving drugs to people whose brain is already irreversibly damaged. The nerve cells are gone. So our attention now is here. Can we intervene sometime in this process in the hopes of preventing dementia? That's the next phase of treatment. Let's skip that. Okay, so I'll skip that too. We have techniques now that let us identify people who are perfectly fine in terms of their memory and thinking, but have already developed the Alzheimer's disease plaques and tangles. One way we can do that is through a sophisticated brain image called a PET scan, and it can identify amyloid plaques. What I'm showing here is the people in blue and red have amyloid plaques as depicted by this PET scan. Around age 70 to 75, somewhere like 25 or 30% of healthy older people have lots of plaques in their brain. So this preclinical phase of Alzheimer's disease, this silent phase, is quite common after age 70 or 75. Many people have preclinical Alzheimer's disease. Here's the PET image. We're looking at a slice of the brain in this horizontal fashion. So the front of the brain would be here and the back here. Here's a person who had it was perfectly normal in terms of memory and thinking. And we see a positive, the PET scan is positive if the colors are red and if the colors are red. This person has no red in their brain. They don't have any plaques. This person has Alzheimer's dementia, and they have lots of red. They've got a lot of plaque burden. Here's another person, another cognitively normal person. They had a PET scan like that. It looks lots of red, looks like this scan. So we would call this preclinical Alzheimer's disease. The assumption, the prediction, is if this person continues to live, they will have enough brain damage that they'll develop Alzheimer's dementia. And in this particular individual person, that's what happened just 3 years after that scan. There's a national study looking at preclinical Alzheimer's disease and giving drugs that we think target the mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease. That's called the A4 study. I just mentioned it because I think the prevention aspect is the new area that we need to emphasize. So that's an ongoing study. So that's what we're doing at the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Washington University, preclinical Alzheimer's disease, that we want to prevent the onset of Alzheimer's dementia. So we're looking at prevention strategies. Here are some websites for anyone who might be interested, including our own Knight ADRC website. We do have about 78% of our volunteers. We have 800 volunteers who we see annually at the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And 78% of them are normal in terms of their memory and thinking. Because remember, our emphasis now is on this preclinical Alzheimer's disease. So we're continuing to look at healthy volunteers. We recruit people 65 and older to come in for these annual assessments. A few of them have St. Louis connections but live in Florida, and they come back to St. Louis to visit family and come in for their annual assessments. I would invite any of you who would be interested in volunteering for our program. If you want, you can check the website or talk to me later, and I'd be happy to discuss with it. But as I look at you, I'm afraid that most of you won't qualify. Remember, you have to be 65 and older. Why don't I end here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Nuss. Computer chips, I'm just thinking in terms of, it's an expensive proposition to take care of all of us over the years ahead. What's the science tell us about insertion of computer chips that will certainly maybe enhance the brain or allow us to function more?
Yes, so the question was, computer chips, can we utilize that technology, or even more broadly, the field of artificial intelligence, to make up the deficits that are caused by Alzheimer's dementia? No one has tried that. I don't know what the promise would be. Certainly, we are open to all considerations. We have no therapy, so if computer chips or AI is useful, happy to entertain it. But so far, that's not been tried.
Yeah, I've got 3 questions. One was the graph that said 50% of people at 85 have Alzheimer's.
Have Alzheimer's in the brain.
This audience.
They don't have Alzheimer's dementia. They have Alzheimer's in the brain. Many of them have dementia, but not everyone.
Okay. The second thing is, should we have brain PET scans if we're so vulnerable at age?
Okay, so the question is, if age is such a factor, and as we age, should we be getting periodic PET scans to determine whether we have the Alzheimer's pathology in the brain? Okay, so here's a couple of responses. That's a reasonable thought. Right now, the PET scans, at least at our place, cost $4,500. And it's not reimbursed by Medicare or any third-party payer, so it's out of pocket. Second, if it's positive, what are you going to do?
You said that if we were normal, that was the time to take drugs before.
We're testing that. I showed you that A4 study that is testing that. We don't know yet whether intervening, we think this is the way to go. We're testing whether that's correct or not. We do not know if you give drugs during that preclinical phase that it will prevent dementia. We don't know that. And that's all, and this is all experimental. So if you go get a PET scan now and it's positive, you can't get a drug because we don't have any that are approved by the FDA for prevention. We're hoping that we'll find that, but we don't have that now.
Okay, the Mediterranean diet, you said it might be helpful. How does that correlate with countries and what is their incidence of Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so, thank you. You know, in general, Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's dementia is the same the world over in general. There are pockets of individuals, including in Italy, where certain segments of the population seem to live long without Alzheimer's dementia. Iceland may be another country. Nigeria, a tribe there, the Yoruba tribe, concentrated around the city of Ibadan, seem to have less Alzheimer's, but these are small pockets. In general, worldwide, the age relationship of Alzheimer's disease holds no matter what. So, countries with the oldest populations, Japan, highest frequency of Alzheimer's disease. Less developed countries have less Alzheimer's disease. But if you think of India, it has much less Alzheimer's disease per population than does the United States. But they're so big, even though few people make it to age 65, the population is so big that they still get a number of people getting there, and so they have it too. But the number one determinant is age, number one. So if you see a variation across countries, it's probably developed countries, older population, less Alzheimer's in less developed countries because not so many people live to 65.
A follow-up, if this treatment of early catching the problem early would work, what would be the tests that, would you still require a PET scan of everybody?
Yeah, so let's be optimistic. Let's say that we find that we can prevent Alzheimer's disease with some of our experimental therapies. Then what? Well, we have to detect people who are still mentally intact, but have begun the Alzheimer process in the brain. Frankly, a PET scan isn't going to be the way to go. Too expensive, too much radiation exposure, just not practical. Many places don't have PET scans. We can analyze those same proteins, the protein for the plaque amyloid, the protein for the tangled tau in the spinal fluid. Matter of fact, I think that's even more accurate and detects the preclinical changes earlier than the PET scan. But let's be frank, not many people are going to have a spinal tap to get the spinal fluid to analyze those proteins. So the new development, and I think you'll be hearing about this, is a blood test. And our group at Washington University and a group in Japan, collaborating with people in Australia, both in the past 18 months have published first indications that a blood test may be useful. If that's true, then I think we can start to think, if we have effective therapies, of screening healthy people with a blood test. So we're spending a lot of time on that.
Do you have a view of Dr. Bredeson's protocols, which seem to have had some success in preventing Alzheimer's and delaying the progression of the disease?
So I like Dale Bredesen a great deal. He and I serve together on the Council for the National Institute on Aging, which funds the Alzheimer's Research Centers. I think he's a very good scientist. He got to UCLA and became very popular very quickly because of his idea of a multi-pronged approach and emphasizing diets and supplements and activity. He wrote a book, it's a very popular book. All of those things, to be frank, are what I try to indicate. They probably can't hurt you. There's no proof that they really help. His studies showing that they, quote, really helped was a very small group of people without any control circumstances. So I have to say, you know, if people want to buy the book, that's fine. He's become quite wealthy because of that. And if you want to take supplements, that's fine. There's no proof that any of that works. It will make your urine more expensive.
There's a lot of anecdotal experience. There's a lot of anecdotal.
Correct.
Evidence.
No, I'm sorry. I wasn't clear. You were correct. Listen, so when you say anecdotal, a report of my wife took this supplement and boy, did she get better. When I say proof, I'm talking about testing it in a scientific way to show that it benefits people who only took the drug and didn't benefit people who were only getting placebo. I'm old enough that I've learned to be cautious in trying to jump on the next phase or fad or whatever. I'll just give you an anecdote. Somebody asked earlier, are women more likely to get Alzheimer's than men? The answer first is yes, because women live longer and they're more likely to reach the age at which they'll get Alzheimer's. But there's a lot of interest in estrogen. And women after the menopause lose estrogen. Brain's full of estrogen receptors. So what happens when women who have had 45, 50 years of estrogen suddenly lose that? Would that make them more susceptible to getting Alzheimer's disease? And in the 1990s, I tell you I'm old, there was a lot of interest in estrogen replacement therapy as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And many physicians would give women over past postmenopausal estrogen, not for menopausal symptoms, but to prevent Alzheimer's disease. That was the thinking. Well, we finally tested that, and we found out women who took estrogen replacement did not have less risk of Alzheimer's. If anything, they had higher risk. Plus, they had all the side effects that go with estrogen. That includes
I don't think Dr. Bredesen uses estrogen.
Yep. As I said, I like Dale. I am not a supporter of his book. Okay.
Here.
Okay.
A number of us, a number of friends observe what I observe, which is that people with dementia rise to the occasion, that you can be out in social circles and that the people seem quite normal. And yet when you talk to the caregiver or the family, they say, oh, no, you don't see him day in and day out. Does that suggest that maybe some social activity will help keep it at bay?
I think, again, staying socially engaged is key. So I think that's very important. Keeping it at bay, I don't know about that, but I hear all the time. I showed you the rate of decline of memory and thinking and functional abilities of a person with Alzheimer's. It was sort of a smooth downhill curve. There are fluctuations in that. People have good days, they have bad days. They do get stimulated often in social situations, and they can do very well. So I think I encourage them, families, to keep the person socially active as much as possible. It doesn't work for everyone, but if it works in that individual, then that's great.